Right now, there are 4.6 million active podcasts in the world, and most of them will lose their listeners before the 4-minute mark. Not because the topics are bad, not because the hosts aren't smart, but because the narration doesn't hold. Today, we're getting into the craft and science of audio narration in podcasting. Specifically, what makes listeners actually stay, what the psychology research says about why people tune in the first place, and what 2026 biggest industry shifts mean for anyone creating audio content. By the end of this episode, you'll understand the structural techniques that separate a podcast people finish from one they abandon, and you'll see exactly where the industry is heading. Joining me is someone who's dug deep into all of this, so let's get right into it. What is it about audio narration that makes or breaks a podcast?
So the thing that most people miss is that audio narration isn't just about having a good voice or interesting content. It's about architecture. According to Podcasting Authority, podcast storytelling techniques are the structural and editorial methods producers use to shape raw audio, interviews, recordings, narration, ambient sound into a sequence that carries a listener from an opening hook all the way to resolution.
Architecture. I like that framing.
And it's a really precise word for it because there are 4 interlocking layers that Podcasting Authority identifies. You've got hook construction, scene setting through sound, the narrative through line, and pacing through edit rhythm. Each one does a specific job, and if one of them is weak, the whole structure wobbles.
Okay, walk me through those. Start with the hook, because that's the one that determines whether someone even gets to minute 4.
Right, so the hook is everything. Podcasting Authority is very specific about this. The opening 60 seconds must establish stakes, and the most durable form of that is what they call the cold open, dropping the listener into a scene mid-action before any introduction or theme music. The classic example they cite is Serial, the podcast that Edison Research credits with triggering the mainstream podcast boom. Sarah Koenig opened that first episode with her voice mid-investigation, not mid-explanation. You were already inside the story before you even knew what the story was.
That's such a good example. And Serial wasn't just critically acclaimed, it genuinely changed what people thought a podcast could be.
Exactly. And it illustrates why the cold open works so well. You're not asking the listener to trust you first and then reward them later. You're rewarding them immediately and then asking them to stay.
What about scene setting through sound? That one feels a little more abstract to me.
So this is actually one of the most underused tools in podcasting. Podcasting Authority calls it NAT sound, natural ambient sound, and the point is that a 3-second clip of a kitchen before an interview with a chef communicates texture that 30 words of narration cannot match at the same pace. Sound anchors listeners in a physical space without you having to describe it.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's not just decoration, it's actually doing narrative work.
It's doing heavy lifting. And then the third layer, the narrative through line, is maybe the most important conceptually. Podcasting Authority draws a really sharp distinction here. Every episode needs one question it is answering. Not a topic, a question. They give this example. What happened to Dana is a through line. The history of the Postal Service is a topic. That distinction determines whether the listener has a reason to stay.
Wait, that's actually a really useful reframe. Because so many podcasts are structured around topics, not questions.
And that's exactly why they lose people. A topic is passive. A question creates tension. And tension is what keeps someone listening.
And the fourth layer, pacing through edit rhythm?
So this is about tempo. Long, uninterrupted interview clips slow things down and build intimacy. Short intercutting of multiple voices accelerates energy. You're essentially using the edit like a musician uses rhythm. Speeding up, slowing down, creating contrast. And all of this matters because of something that's unique to audio as a medium.
What do you mean?
Audio imposes a constraint that neither prose nor film shares. The listener cannot rewind their attention. A story beat that lands on page 3 of a novel can be reread. On audio, it is gone. That's straight from Podcasting Authority, and I think it's one of the most clarifying things you can say about this medium. Every second carries higher stakes.
That's a little terrifying, honestly. Every second is a one-shot deal.
It is. And it's also what makes great audio narration so impressive when you encounter it. Because the person behind it is making hundreds of micro decisions that the listener never consciously notices, but absolutely feels.
Okay, so we've got the craft side, but I want to zoom out for a second and ask, why do people even listen to podcasts in the first place? Because understanding the motivation has to inform the narration, right?
100%. And there's actually really solid research on this. A peer-reviewed study published in PLOS One by Tobin and Guadagno looked at exactly this question. What predicts podcast listening, and what are the psychological outcomes? They surveyed 306 adults across multiple countries.
And what did they find?
So the traits that positively predicted podcast listening were openness to experience, interest-based curiosity, and need for cognition. Basically, people who listen to podcasts tend to be intellectually curious and genuinely enjoy thinking, which tells you something important about what kind of narration works. It needs to reward that curiosity, not just fill time.
That tracks. But was there anything surprising in the findings?
Yeah, actually. Contrary to what you might expect, need to belong negatively predicted podcast listening. So the people who are most driven by social connection are actually less likely to be podcast listeners. And neuroticism also negatively predicted it. The study also found that time spent listening wasn't directly associated with outcomes like autonomy or meaning, but parasocial relationships and social engagement around podcasts were related to positive outcomes.
Parasocial relationships, meaning the feeling of knowing the host even though you've never met them.
Exactly. And that's where narration becomes really powerful. The personal nature of audio, your voice in someone's ears, can feel like a one-on-one conversation. That intimacy is what turns a casual listener into someone who comes back every week.
So the narration isn't just delivering information, it's building a relationship.
That's the whole game. And this connects directly to why storytelling is so central to effective audio narration. According to psychologists cited by Podbean's Storytelling Guide, people are 20 times more likely to remember facts when they're presented in a story rather than a dry list of data. 20 times.
20 times. That's not a marginal difference. That's a completely different category of retention.
Right. And Arianna Huffington put it really cleanly. She said, people think in stories, not statistics, and marketers need to be master storytellers. Now, she was talking about marketing, but it applies to any audio narration. The brain is just wired to process and retain narrative differently than it processes raw information.
And Guy Raz, the host of How I Built This, has talked about this too, right?
Yeah, he's described storytelling as a growth hack for brands, saying it enables consumers to connect in a deeper, more personal way. And what's interesting is that this applies across all podcast types. It's not just for narrative or fiction podcasts. Even a business or interview podcast can use storytelling structure to make information stick.
Okay, here's something I want to dig into. There's a framework from a pretty unexpected source that apparently applies directly to podcast structure. The South Park guys?
Yes, Trey Parker and Matt Stone. In a widely circulated NYU lecture on story mechanics, they laid out what Podcasting Authority calls the but therefore beat framework. The idea is that scenes should connect with but or therefore rather than and then. And then is just a sequence of events. But introduces conflict. Therefore shows consequence. That's what creates momentum.
So, and then this happened, and then this happened is a list. But this happened, but then this complicated it, therefore this resulted. That's a story.
Exactly. And Podcasting Authority notes that audio narration draws from 3 adjacent disciplines: radio journalism, literary narrative theory, and screenwriting. The but therefore framework is the screenwriting contribution. It's a tool that professional TV writers use, and it translates perfectly to podcast structure.
I love that. The craft of audio narration is basically borrowing the best tools from every storytelling tradition that came before it.
And it has to, because the medium is so demanding. Remember, the listener can't rewind their attention, so you need every structural tool available to keep them oriented and engaged.
All right, let's shift to the industry picture, because the numbers here are genuinely staggering. Where does podcasting actually stand right now?
So according to the Podvenues State of Podcasting 2026 report, which synthesizes data from Edison Research, the IAB, and Podcast Index, there are currently 584 million global podcast listeners monthly, up 11.2% year over year. In the US alone, there are 144 million monthly listeners, and there are 4.6 million active podcasts worldwide.
4.6 million. That's the number I opened with, and it still hits differently every time I say it.
And the ad revenue side is even more striking. US podcast ad revenue hit $4.8 billion, up 13.7% year over year. What's notable is that ad revenue is growing faster than the audience itself. Listener counts grew 6.4%, while revenue grew 13.7%. Brands are chasing this audience hard.
So the money is outpacing the growth. That tells you something about how valuable this audience is perceived to be.
Exactly. And the audience demographics are really important for anyone thinking about narration strategy. The 18 to 34 cohort drives 39% of all podcast listening, the largest of any age bucket, according to Podvenues. That's the audience that's most demanding in terms of quality and most likely to abandon something that doesn't hold their attention.
And that's also the audience that's changing how they discover podcasts, right? Because the platform story is shifting.
This is one of the most counterintuitive findings in the Podvenues report. Among listeners aged 18 to 34, YouTube has overtaken Spotify as the number one platform for discovering new podcasts, 44% versus 31%. Spotify still leads overall listening share at 33.8%, but for discovery among younger listeners, it's YouTube.
Wait, so the future of audio narration might actually be visual? That's a wild sentence.
It really is. And the format data backs it up. 72% of new shows launched in the last 12 months record a video version. 84% of growing shows publish vertical clips to TikTok, Reels, or Shorts weekly. And Podspotters noted that Spotify, which built its entire identity on audio, started signing video distribution partnerships in late 2025. When an audio-only giant decides it needs video to stay relevant, that tells you where things are heading.
So the narration craft we've been talking about, the hooks, the through lines, the pacing, all of that still applies, but now it's being delivered through a visual layer too.
Right. The audio narration principles don't go away. If anything, they become more important because now you're competing for attention across more surfaces. But the delivery mechanism is expanding. According to the Media Leader's 2026 forecast, cited by podcastvideos.com, audio will no longer be just audio. Radio, podcasts, and digital listening now exist within broader visual and connected environments.
And what about AI? Because that's the other massive shift happening right now.
So the 2026 audio predictions from podcastvideos.com are pretty clear on this. AI is being embedded within creative workflows to generate smarter audio assets that adapt in real time to context and audience behavior. We're talking AI-driven, personalized audio experiences where listener preference informs content suggestions. And on the production side, Podspotters notes that AI will write show notes, clean audio, and pull quotes for social clips.
So AI handles the mechanical stuff, but the narration craft, the storytelling architecture, that still has to come from a human?
That's the tension, isn't it? AI can optimize and automate, but the PLOS ONE research tells us that what drives people to listen is curiosity and the need for cognition. They want to think, they want to be challenged. And the parasocial relationship, the feeling of a real human voice in your ear, that's hard to replicate artificially, at least for now.
And there's also the monetization picture changing. It's not just ads anymore.
Brian Barletta, president of Podcast Movement, said that 2026 is the year creators build broader revenue ecosystems, integrating brand partnerships, memberships, live events, IP licensing, and product releases alongside traditional ads. The days of relying solely on advertising revenue are over for serious creators.
And the Podvenues data had something interesting about which shows are actually growing fastest, right? It wasn't the biggest names.
Yeah, this was one of the more surprising findings. Shows with 5,000 to 50,000 downloads per episode grew the fastest in 2026, up 22% year over year, outpacing both small shows and the top 100 networks. The independent middle is winning. Which makes sense when you think about it. Those shows are niche enough to have a loyal, specific audience, but large enough to attract real monetization.
And that connects back to the narration point. A niche show with a strong narrative voice and a clear through line is going to hold its audience better than a broad show that's trying to be everything to everyone.
Completely. Podspotters made this point really directly. Audiences are splitting into smaller groups and people are picky with their time. You can't rely on general topic formats anymore. The people who grow in this next wave will be the ones who focus on a specific audience and give them something worth sticking around for.
And something worth sticking around for is essentially a narration problem. It's a craft problem.
That's exactly right. The global podcast market is projected to hit around $114 billion by 2030, up from around $31.5 billion in 2025, according to Podspotters. That's a yearly growth rate of roughly 29.5%. More money, more competition, more shows. The only sustainable differentiator is the quality of the storytelling.
And the Q Productions podcast guide makes a point that I think is worth naming explicitly. Creating a podcast that sounds polished and connects with listeners isn't as simple as grabbing a mic and talking. Planning, concept, format, audience, all of that has to come before you even hit record.
The Q Productions Guide puts it well. Planning is the foundation of every successful podcast. Without it, even the best ideas risk coming across as inconsistent, unclear, or forgettable. And the Pod Squeeze Best Practices Guide from 2026 makes the same point. Writing your scripts and recording your audio may be an art, but getting your podcast name out there is a science.
Art and science. That's actually a really good way to hold the whole thing together.
It is. The narration is the art, the hooks, the through lines, the pacing, the parasocial intimacy. But the strategy around it, knowing your audience, choosing your format, distributing across the right platforms, that's the science. And you need both.
Okay, so when you step back from everything we've covered, the craft, the psychology, the industry data, what's the through line here? What does it all actually add up to?
Here's what I keep coming back to. The market is more crowded than it has ever been. 4.6 million active podcasts, 584 million global listeners, and ad revenue growing faster than the audience. In that environment, the only thing that actually protects you is the quality of your narration. Not your equipment, not your distribution strategy. The story you tell and how you tell it.
And the research backs that up. People are 20 times more likely to remember a story than a list of facts. The brain is literally built for narrative.
And the PLOS One study tells us that the people who are drawn to podcasts are already curious, already intellectually engaged. They're not passive consumers. They're active listeners who want to be rewarded for their attention. So if your narration doesn't deliver on that, if it doesn't have a real through line, a real question it's answering, they will leave. And on audio, once they're gone, that moment is gone.
The listener cannot rewind their attention.
Exactly. And the tools are changing. AI, video layers, multi-platform distribution. But the human need for a compelling story hasn't changed at all. If anything, in a world of algorithmic content and synthetic audio, a genuinely crafted human narrative voice is going to stand out more, not less.
That's a really hopeful note, actually. The more automated everything gets, the more valuable the craft becomes.
And the independent middle is proving it. Those shows with 5,000 to 50,000 downloads growing 22% year over year, they're not winning because of massive production budgets. They're winning because they know their audience and they've built a narration voice that audience trusts.
So here's what this really comes down to. Whether you're starting a podcast, trying to grow one, or just trying to understand why some shows hold you and others don't, the answer is almost always in the narration. The cold open that drops you mid-scene. The through line that gives you a reason to stay. The pacing that makes 40 minutes feel like 10.
And the parasocial intimacy that makes a stranger's voice feel like a conversation you've been waiting to have.